Good afternoon. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for coming today. We've got a wonderful event for you. You can follow this event, I always get this wrong, but on Twitter at AC Eurasia, #Russia Factor. And I'm going to turn this over to Maria Snegavaya, who will be leading us in the discussion today. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. It's my big honor to be here today. Thank you so much, Ambassador Herbst.
Excuse me, I forgot to mention, we thank the Nadav Foundation for sponsoring today's event. Please.
So it's a big honor to be here today. Just a brief introduction. I am Maria Snegavaya. I'm an adjunct fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, as well as a postdoc at Johns Hopkins University, working on Russia and the recent wave of populism in East Central Europe. Now, I wanted to start by introducing our participants and then giving you a brief overview of the recent dynamic in Russia, about which the great reports of our presenters have been written. So first of all, on my left is Ksenia Kirillova. Is an investigative journalist and analyst focused on Russian society, the mechanism of action of Russian propaganda, soft power, active measures, foreign policy, and all the hot topics that everybody's interested here in today. Ms. Kirillova is the author of several hundred articles, including research on Russian propaganda, soft power, following the Integrity Initiative project, Homeland Security Today, EU Today, Kiev Post, Euromaidan Press, and other projects. While living in Russia, Ksenia, who is actually born in Yekaterinburg, the city that will come up often today, I suspect. Ksenia worked as a journalist at the largest Ural media organization, Ural Worker. She also worked at the Ural branch of Novaya Gazeta, which is the biggest independent journal remaining this day in Russia. At the United States, Ksenia worked with the Associated Press, Newsweek, The Daily Beast, and other media outlets. Today, Ksenia presents her report written for the Atlantic Council, Prospects of the Russian Protest Movement. Next to Ksenia is Dr. Olga Khvostunova, who is the director of the Institute of Modern Russia and editor-in-chief of the Institute of Modern Russia website. Olga is also a well-published journalist and a researcher who has worked as a contributing editor at Kommersant, one of Russia's leading business daily. Olga was also a Fulbright scholar at Columbia University's Harriman Institute, a very respected organization devoted to the study of Eastern Europe, and has authored hundreds of articles covering various issues in Russian politics, including energy markets, opposition movements, and Russian foreign policy. And finally, of course, Ambassador John Herbst, who essentially, to whom we are all grateful for organizing this fantastic panel. He is the director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Ambassador Herbst served for 31 years as a Foreign Service officer in the US Department of State. He was the US ambassador to Ukraine from 2003 to 2006. Prior to his ambassadorship in Ukraine, he was the ambassador to Uzbekistan from 2000 to 2003. Ambassador Herbst previously served as US Consul General in Jerusalem, Principal Deputy to the Ambassador at Large for the newly independent states, Director of the Office of Independent States and Commonwealth Affairs, Director of the Regional Affairs in the Near East Bureau, and etc. Ambassador Herbst has also written extensively on stability operations, Central Asia, Ukraine, and Russia, and we're certainly benefiting today from his expertise on the topic. Now, before we proceed to presentation of today's report, I just wanted to give those of you who may be less familiar with the current situation in Russia and the reason for our panel today, a small overview of the current dynamic in the country. This September 8th, 2019, Russia had several regional elections lined up, including specifically 19 regional governors' election and 13 elections in the regional parliament. Now, this is not a new development. In fact, Russia holds these regional elections every year, and they created this, the Day of United Voting, essentially, to accommodate all of the different elections that take place in the regions. What was new this particular year is that opposition in Russia has actually been able to prepare quite well. And specifically, since Moscow Duma election also was scheduled on September 8th, earlier this year, the opposition candidate mobilized and did almost the unthinkable. They collected enough signatures and essentially jumped over all of the hurdles that the Russian government, the Kremlin, has put to them. And essentially, the expectation was that at least some of them would be allowed to run for the Moscow Duma election. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The Kremlin found pretexts not to let them run, which in turn created a huge avalanche of protests in Moscow. Specifically in this August, we saw the largest protest in Moscow since 2011. 60,000 people gathered in the streets. The result was a really brutal crackdown of the Kremlin on the protesters, which in turn created another series of protests, this time to defend the political prisoners arrested because they were trying to convince the Kremlin to let the candidates run. Subsequently, actually, the opposition again mobilized and has been able to do something called smart voting, essentially to convince the Moscow residents to unite around maybe not their preferred candidates, but other people who were at least somewhat oppositionary minded. And again, quite a remarkable success was achieved because the United Russia this time around lost 13 seats in the Moscow Duma. The opposition almost took the majority. Another interesting dynamic that we see is the shift in the preferences in support for the political prisoners in Russia. So the recent surveys actually suggest that the Russian public opinion shifts towards support of people who were arrested by the Kremlin. This is again unprecedented. In the past, the majority of people actually supported the Kremlin crackdown on the opposition. So this is new as well. Ultimately, just as we speak today, another report on the topic has been released by the Liberal Mission Foundation, featuring some great Russian political scientists on the topic. They point out the important shift in the media consumption preferences that is associated to the rising support for the opposition in Russia. That is the substantive shift towards the internet media, which, as they suggest, is driving the polarization of the Russian society and presents increasing risks to the Kremlin. So I hope we get to discuss all these issues in more details. And I will now leave Ksenia the word to briefly describe her report on prospects of the Russian protest movement.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Maria, for this great presentation. Yes, on the one hand, we really see some positive tendencies in the Russian society. First of all, as Maria already said, it's increasing of protest movement, and now according to Levada Center and other sociologists' data, about 70% people heard some critique of Russian authorities, and more than 50% of Russia disagree with Putin policy, and Putin's rating had fallen during the last year since the unpopular pension reform. For example, now it's dropped below its historical minimum. It's less than 32%. It's unprecedented. And on the other hand, as sociologists say, Russian society radically changed during the last 2 years, and people require respect, and they are ready to fight for their rights. About 28% of people said that they are ready to go to protest action. For example, 2 years ago it was 16%. It's really a huge increase. But on the other hand, unfortunately, I see some vulnerabilities of Russian protest movement that still prevents it to develop on a real threat to Putin's regime on a full-scale federal level protest. And I want to distinguish 3 conditions that should be met if we want a serious protest rally around the country, from coast to coast. First of all, the reason, the cause of protest action should be some social problems that is common for all Russians, for all Russian regions. But now we can see that the most of protest rally they caused by some local issues. It's very hard to develop them to federal level. For example, we mentioned already my hometown, Yekaterinburg. It was a huge protest against construction of cathedral temple on the heart of the city, and even Putin paid attention to this protest movement, but it was just local issue. The second condition is that the reason of protest should unite people. As we can see in Euromaidan, Ukrainian Euromaidan, it's united people from liberal activists and human rights defenders to even nationalists and church leaders. But these local issues, yes, on the one hand, they can unite different kinds of people, including people who were not interested in politics before that. But on the other hand, some local issues could split even dissident movement. For example, in Yekaterinburg, some part of liberal movement, they were Orthodox Christians, and they were not ready to go against church. They were ready to go against authorities, against corruptions, but they were not ready to protest against church. So even dissident movement was divided. And third condition, the main, on my point of view, that people should understand that Putin cannot solve the problem, that the problems is direct result of Putin's regime. But now, unfortunately, in many cases, Putin still is able to represent himself as a good Tsar, good king, who can solve all this problem, and people continue to appeal to him. Even we remember case of Ivan Golunov. People appealed to Putin and he solved this problem. The same happened in Yekaterinburg. When people appealed to Putin, it's the only chance to solve this problem. So in this case, if people continue to see Putin as the only person who can help them, this protest will always remain on local level. And the next problem that many Russian people still believe in Russian propaganda that Russia is surrounded by enemies, and Putin is the only person who can protect them from this external threat. And this is a big problem because they believe that in the case of collapse Putin regime, they will have devastation, chaos, and even worse. And they're afraid of this perspective more than of current reality. And another problem is differences in views of in the perspective about desirable future, because you probably know that all these years, for decades, Russian propaganda tried to cultivate the image of Soviet Union and Stalin, but now this propaganda works against Putin because they miss Soviet Union, and they see that Putin doesn't meet their expectation. But many people really dream about new Stalin. Putin used this propaganda to legitimize himself, to represent himself as a new Stalin, but now it doesn't work. So on the one hand, according to Levada Center data, rating of approval of Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin achieved its historical maximum, and more than 55% people approve his policy. It's really huge. And on the other hand, even Russian military analysts admit that these people now have opposition views. They're not satisfied by Putin's ruling. But it's a problem because it's almost impossible to find a common ground between liberal activists and people who support Soviet Union, who dream about restore Soviet Union. And of course, these people who like Stalin, they don't consider liberal leaders as appropriate leaders for them. So it's still a lot of to do for Russian protest movement to consolidate, to fight some common social problems, to unite people in every Russian region, and to explain people that this problem is direct result of Putin regime. And of course, it's will be hard work try to refute this propaganda concept about Putin as the defender from external threat, because his aggressive policy created this confrontation. So Russian dissidents should break government monopoly on patriotic rhetoric or safety rhetoric. Also to talk about security, that Putin is real threat for Russian safety, security, and it's a hard work.
Thank you, Ksenia. So one of the interesting developments about this wave of the Russian protests, right, is the rising representation of the Russian youth in those. So here I wanted to Olga to ask Olga to talk to us a little bit about this new phenomenon to which her report is devoted.
Thank you, Maria. I want to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this event. It's a great honor to speak to you guys. So my part of the research focused on the role of the Russian youth in this protests, and I wanted to say a few things about the Russian youth at first, so we understand why this is a phenomenon. I've done some research on the Russian youth earlier this year, and it's been published as a report. We researched it along with the economist Vladimir Milov. So in this report, we looked at some numbers, and for example, what percentage of the Russian population is the Russian youth? So apparently it's not such a huge political factor, because there is about 10 million of the Russian young people who are younger than 25, which makes them about 8% of the Russian population. So in terms of voting, that's even a smaller factor. But why should we care about Russian youth? The reason we care is because over the last more than a decade, the Russian youth was one of the most loyal groups to the Kremlin. And that has changed over the recent 2-3 years. And for the first time, we saw that something changed inside the Russian youth was during March 2017 protests organized by Alexei Navalny, when we saw a lot of Russian young faces. Sometimes in the Kremlin propaganda, it was called the protest of teenagers or kindergarten students, because there were so many of them. A few words about what is known about Russian youth. It's not a homogeneous group, and it's just as polarized as the Russian society at large. And there are basically the same sort of lines of polarization as we observe in Russia. For example, some researchers see a group that they call, it's just one label, hipsters, and there's an opposite group that's called patsani, which is basically young thugs. So for the first group, we have people who are interested more in democracy, who have liberal values, who are looking positively at the West. Within the second group, the values are more authoritarian. People are focused on security. The sort of juxtaposition between ours and them is stronger. And these two groups are constantly at opposition with each other. And that was the same conflict that researchers saw in the 90s. And this is a larger conflict within the Russian society. So what happened in 2017? So the 2017 protest that Alexei Navalny organized was about corruption. So that was the first time that we saw that the Russian young people broke away from the Kremlin's grasp. One of the reasons that happened was the failure of the Kremlin's youth policy. So starting in early 2000s, when Vladimir Putin just came to power, the Kremlin put a lot of effort into trying to rein in the youth. And one of the tools that's been used is the sort of Soviet-style, Komsomol-style movement. Initially, it was a movement called Walking Together, Идущие вместе. And then there was another one called Nashi, which was much more popular, much stronger. And for a while, it seemed that the Kremlin completely seduced, I guess, the Russian youth with all kinds of opportunities, with events like Seliger camp, where young Russians could visit and meet Vladimir Putin, for example, and they were given different opportunities, social lifts, career opportunities that were really, really attractive to a lot of Russian people. And that was for the first time since the 90s that the young people saw that the government is interested in them. They felt that they're being included into the country life and that they're important and they were validated. However, after 2011 protests that were about the rigging of the parliamentary election, and they followed the infamous swap between Putin and Medvedev, it was obvious to the Kremlin that this efforts to try to control the youth, which also was present during those protests, but not in such large numbers, that those efforts failed and the initial movement was dismantled. So for 6-7 years, the Kremlin was not really trying to do anything with the youth, and the youth broke away free and realized that no one is interested in it. It has no opportunities. Economy is declining. Something needs to be done. So that's why anti-corruption claims by Alexei Navalny resonated with the youth, and that's why the youth came out in large numbers. In the summer of 2019, the same factors were still present. However, we also see larger developments. One is the growing age gap between the youth and the Russian leadership. These are age differences that are always present, but they're harder to bridge right now. A second factor is the growing importance of social media and internet among Russian young people, who are less prone to the Kremlin's propaganda. They get their information from internet, and they communicate with each other, and a lot of concepts of Russian propaganda are just not working for the Russian youth. There is also contextual factors. One of them is a growing protest sentiment within the Russian society at large. I think Ksenia talked about it in detail. And yet another factor has to do with the breaking down of the post-Crimea consensus, where a lot of people were brought together by this patriotic mobilization, and now this euphoria is fading away, and people are facing brutal reality that nothing good can come out of the Kremlin's policies. Yet specific factor that could play a certain role in the summer 2019 protest was the participation of rappers and music bands that are popular among the Russian youth, and because they were consistently banned over the last year and a half, those bands and this music has become more political, more anti-government, and you can see in the media coverage that's been paying attention to that development. So calls to go out and protest against police brutality, for example, was one of the factors that the August 10th protest was the largest with participation of the sad rappers and youth heroes. And one more thing I wanted to mention when it comes to the Russian youth. There is a lot of research into political apathy of the youth, not just in Russia, but in many countries in the West and beyond the West. Young people feel increasingly excluded from mainstream politics, or they feel mistrust for established parties and try to find their own ways to connect, to organize, to network. And the same thing is happening in Russia, except that Russian young people focus on local issues, try to organize volunteer networks and sort of pursue the so-called politics of small deeds. And this is where they feel they can make a difference. This doesn't translate yet into national efforts for many reasons, but this is something that I think that is important and is worth watching.
Thank you so much, Olga. I'm now going to proceed to asking several questions to our participants. I think it's great how your reports actually, mutually complement each other. How about Ksenia? So you mentioned this point about the sporadic level of the protest activity, right? They kind of come out on during unexpected times on similarly unrelated topics. We actually have been debating this a lot with some friends of mine in Russia. Russians are generally, kind of fatalistic when it comes to their certainty about change in the future. A lot of my friends tell me, hey, these protests, they're really maybe increasing, but we don't really see fundamental change in people's attitude. So there's a difference between protesting per se and between politicization of those protests, right? Those the blame attribution, those participants being able to challenge the state directly. So with that, I have two questions to you. First of all, is it true? Do you have any data to really demonstrate perhaps that we do increase the protest propensity across Russia? Is there any data to support that? And second of all, do we see just the rise of protest activity, or it is really a politicization of the protests, meaning people becoming more demanding in terms of from political system? They want a real political change rather than just being unhappy about the local issue.
Yes, thank you for your question. Yes, I just recently saw some sociological data, and you're absolutely right. It's a big difference between public attitude towards the government and the willing to participate in protest action. For example, during the last year, the level of disagreement with government policy developed from about 17% after pension reform, then it's declined a bit to January of this year, and now increased during summer protest actions. So, according to Alexei Kudrin's research, about 80 or 19% of people want some change in society. It's a huge percent, especially given that after 19th, majority of Russians didn't want any change. They wanted only stability, and now they want to change something. I already mentioned dropping of level of their confidence in Putin and approval of his policy. So yes, it's about 17, 19, 19 people who disagree with government. But as we already mentioned, about less than 30% told that they're ready to participate in protest action. It's also a big difference between these 2 points. And this number also changed, as I mentioned. In winter, it was about 16% of people, and now it's about 25-28 who are ready to go to protest action.
Increasing,
yeah. Yes, it's increasing, but the most of protests, they concern local issues. And yes, it's local, ecological, and economic level. So about 75% of this protest, and about possibility to politicize these processes, I think it's, you know, I watched such tendency, probably you will agree with me, in Russian society during last years, that in every unpopular step of government, people tried to find explanation why the sacrifices were made. So they wanted to return this illusion, this feeling of stability. For example, when Russian government destroyed food during anti-sanctions policy, it didn't entail some mass protest. People tried to explain for themselves that it was needed. But now it's harder and harder to explain for themselves that it's just local issue, that nothing changed, nothing bad happened. And if people realize that even government policy threatened to them, yes, it's possible. Like in Moscow, it started as a local issue, but then it's developed to a protest for people's safety because of a brutal police response. Now it's turned out that it's just dangerous to walk on the street. You could be arrested, like Pavel Ustinov, who didn't participate in protest action. He just was somewhere around talking to his friend on the phone. So it's a huge mobilization of people because it's evaluated in protest for people's security, for the basic rights. So yes, it's way for some politicization of protest.
So people respond to something that is relevant to them,
Yeah.
as far as I understand, right, what you're saying. And over the years, over this experiencing consistent disappointment with the state,
Yes.
to respond to them, eventually they politicize, right?
Yes, especially the more government takes repressions against them, the more they politicize.
Olga, on a related point to you, right? So first of all, you mentioned a very interesting point, which I think is absolutely true, that the younger generation Russian first comes across as the most pro-Putin, right? We even had this phenomenon of the Putin's generation. Now, all of a sudden, it's the most protest one. So how do you explain that? And does it mean that we really have to care about this younger people who really don't seem to have any steady convictions and keep fluctuating, right? Why is it so flexible, and does it mean that we should care? And second, a lot of people, precisely because of what you're saying about overrepresentation of the youth in the protests, after this summer protests, a lot of people hope that as students come back from vacation in Moscow, we actually will see the protests grow, right? Because there will be more students who will join in this cause. Unfortunately, that's the opposite of what has happened, right? If eventually the protest has decreased dramatically in size, what it looks like. How do you explain that? Did the youth just shift their preferences again?
Well, on your first question, the Putin generation, I think there is a tendency to come up with a label and just put it there, and that label explains everything. So that happened with the Putin generation. That kind of like was publicized in the Russian media and in the West, and I think it was originally not very accurate, because, like I said, Russian youth is really diverse, and it's like you try to explain the American youth. Can you come up with one term that describes all of the young people? I think it's more complicated than that. So still, there are sort of certain groups within the youth that could be still described as the Putin generation. There is always a percentage of Russian people who will be willing to cooperate with the Kremlin no matter what for the opportunities provided by the state. Same applies to younger people. So if you go out to a pro-Putin protest featuring young Russian people, they will say anything to support Putin in hopes to move ahead. However, if you go to the opposition rally and you ask the other young people, they will be saying that Putin is the root of all evil, and we should fight against him, etc., etc. So there is at least this general misunderstanding when it comes to the youth. However, there is a true to the point that recently we have seen the change, and I think one of the reasons we saw it has to do with a new generation sort of coming to the forefront of Russian politics. So say 10 years ago, we were talking about young people who remember the 90s, who grew up during the 90s and still were shaped by those realities. Now we have young people coming of age during the aughts and 2010s, when that was relatively secure and stable period, and so those young Russians probably are more willing to take risks, are more looking for freedoms to self-actualize, to grow creatively, looking for career opportunities that are not available in the current political regime. So this is something that will be will be gaining momentum, because more and more of those people will come of age. To the second point, why we haven't seen more students coming out to protest in September. I think it was September 29, right?
Yeah, I think so.
The sanctioned protest. I thought about it, and one of the reasons I think we haven't seen is exactly because students get busy with their studies, and it's actually one of the reasons a lot of activities go down as people are distracted by their daily routines. Another reason is a lack of sort of high calls for participation coming from their heroes, such as rappers, like journalists like Yuri Dud, who is very popular with the youth. And also, it's really interesting that when you have elections coming up, you have an incentive. You sort of trying to change a concrete situation, and you come out to protest to support a certain opposition leader, or you come to protest against mass arrests or something like that. But after the fact, after the election, especially when you know that the turnout was about 22%, you can see the level of political participation that is real. After the fact, the incentive is not there, so you have to have a concrete cause or a call or a political leader that you can coalesce around. So these are the factors.
Just a small correction, that I actually think that Dud was at the September 29th protest, yeah. But just to summarize, essentially, you believe that we see a different generation coming to power, right?
Yeah.
More self-actualized, and without the experience of 1990s, right? That made them hold on to Putin's so-called stability. But these kids had enough of the stability, and they want change now.
Yeah.
Excellent. Ambassador, so your perspective is particularly valuable here as one of the outside observer, right? Me personally, living in the United States for quite some time, I can't help but notice that unfortunately Putin's regime also had a very negative reflection on the Russian society overall. So I hear an increasing number of experts saying that, hey, Russians they don't want democracy, they just, autocratic-minded. Nothing's going to change. So what they say? Yes, you have some protests that they're still relatively small in scale. Compare them to Hong Kong protests, for example. It's absolutely uncomparable. 60,000 in the streets as opposed to over 1.5 million, right? I think in Hong Kong. Why do we care? We've seen this before. We've seen monetization of benefits, much larger scale protests. We've seen 2009, 2012. Putin's rating has been as low as it is right now, in low 60s before. Why is that important? Do you think we see some kind of fundamental change, or is it the same old?
I think the most important thing to emphasize is we don't know what's going on. There is what I would call the default position of people who want to have good relations with Moscow, no matter what Moscow policies are, that the Russian people are long-suffering. They are happy to salute their vozhd, their supreme leader. They are passive. And that's true as long as you overlook the 4 or 5 historical bunts or revolutions in Russian history. I'm not just talking about 1917, I'm not talking about 1905. Go back to Pugachev, go back to Stenka Razin. What we know, if you watch carefully Russian history, is that by and large there's a status quo, there's a status quo, there's a status quo, until suddenly there's a convulsion and there's a new status quo. Mm-hmm. So that's point 1. Point 2, I have an almost metaphysical argument that I've used in discussing Russia's future. And that is that the policies that the Kremlin is pursuing right now, both foreign and domestic, ensures the decline of Russia. Because to be a world-class power, you need a world-class economy. And to be a world-class economy in the 21st century, you need to be open to stimuli, and you have to use the talents of your people so that when they produce something of value, they personally benefit. Not a system in which every police captain can take over a business run by some local successful entrepreneur without a roof, a krisha. Mm-hmm. And so if Russia is going to be a great power in 50 years, the type of command crony capitalism we see in Russia has to be dismissed. That's the second point. But the third point comes to the relevance of this event. We don't know when and how the political system in Russia will change. But we have good reason to suspect, watching Russian history, understanding Russian history, or for that matter, watching the contemporary world, that change is going to come. So it may be that these protests that are wonderfully chronicled in the paper, and we have it both in English and Russian, are a harbinger of a significant change to come, or not. But because we don't have a real clear insight to what is happening, we need to be paying attention. And so it may be that 2 or 3 years from now, we'll say, no, this was a false spring. But it may not be. Mm-hmm. And I think it's safer to say, and you could call me on this in 15 years, that Russia's future will look more like this paper than the notion we'll get a quasi-Stalinist in behind Putin. I don't think that's going to happen.
Excellent, thank you so much. Just to sum it up, we need to care because the changes to the status quo, as the Russian history has demonstrated repeatedly, is quite unpredictable, and we need to be monitoring them, especially keeping in mind that we are quite convinced the current direction the Kremlin is taking the country is leading us to nowhere, and the country is nowhere. Ksenia, to relate actually Ambassador Herbst's point to your report, so you talk a lot about what motivates the Russians to protests, and also what the obstacles to that protests as you see it right now. But if we talk about the long term, can you say that you see some long-term changes among the Russian society that may make it different, along with what Ambassador Herbst has been saying? Do we see some kind of internal modernization happening? You, for example, mentioned this rising support for Stalin. Mm-hmm. Ironically, Stalin here is perceived as some kind of opposition to Putin, who is like the strong hand, who can finally manage the corruption and establish the order that Putin couldn't establish. At the same time, we discussed, and Olga has mentioned, right, that order may not be necessarily what the younger generations want. Maybe they want the change, right? So does it mean that we see that some modernization impulses within the Russian society, more in line with Ambassador Herbst's comments, may be challenging these traditionalist attitudes? And maybe we shouldn't be as afraid then that Stalin's support for Stalin and demand for Stalin is rising?
Yes, thank you, but it's very hard to predict something with current Russia, especially given that Russian society is extremely divided. You're absolutely right, because yes, with Stalin, it was a clear propaganda trick, because image of Stalin created by propaganda has nothing to do with real Joseph Stalin, who was a Soviet dictator who sent to death millions of people. But propaganda created an image of Stalin as a winner who won the World War II, who saved the world, his strong hand, who just shot corruptionists without any hesitations. So yes, Putin used this image to justify his regime and his ruling, to represent himself as a new Stalin. But the problem is that Putin propaganda needs some image of external threat. Because it helps him to use this fear against war, against chaos, against devastation. So, but people already started to ask, even who supported Putin, that he still cannot solve this problem with external threat. He still cannot defeat all these enemies, United States and even Ukraine. So yes, these people really want for Stalin, but it's older generation, young generation. But young generation is also divided. Olga was absolutely right. She did a great research about students, but now Putin's propaganda started to work on earlier stage with school kids. Probably you heard about young army. So they don't offer any social benefits or career opportunities to these people. They're too young, they're school children. They just try to convince them in some propaganda narrative. And it doesn't work well, because many of school children also participate in protest action and Navalny actions. It's school children especially, they have nothing to lose, yet they don't have property or career. They just want to change something, to find their place in society. But some school people, some school kids, they are susceptible to this patriotic propaganda also. So it's also different tendencies. It's very hard to predict, but people's anger is growing. And as Vladislav and Azemtsev mentioned, it's no way under current regime to improve Russian economy. So it will be continue of falling living standards. So people will be, I think, more willing to go to protest. And one scenario, it's also possible that Russian government will try to satisfy this pro-Soviet part, because they're afraid of liberal part of society much more than pro-Soviet. They will try to satisfy them, for example, to sacrifice part of system liberals and corruptionists, and to create illusions that they they make some shift to Soviet style. It's possible, but it depends on how liberal opposition will able to take a leadership on these protests? It depends on many factors. It's hard to predict.
So to sum it up, the protest has a lot of diverse streams inside of it, right? So we see on one hand the modernizing as it's part of the Russian society represented by the younger groups primarily, probably also in part this is driven by different media consumption preferences, which we haven't yet discussed in detail, right? But at the same time you have more traditional core, the conventional Putin supporters whose support also tends to be eroded, right, by the stagnating incomes and worsening living conditions, essentially. That's possibly one of the reasons why we actually haven't seen such a large protest after the retirement age increase back in 2018. It did decline the ratings, right, but the protests were not there because this is Putin's core. It actually, what happens, it becomes less mobilized, but maybe it doesn't show up in the opposition protests as yet because they are traditional support. Olga, same kind of similar question to you, but with regards to the younger groups, because again, it seems that we observe two opposite developments within these groups as well. On the one hand, as you pointed out, younger, more mobilized, more civically engaged groups, partly probably, I would imagine, that they grew up in families that already made some money during the 2000s. Maybe they have different preferences now, right? This is one part. Probably we typically call them quote-unquote Muscovites, right? These developed Europeanized Russians who actually want political change. But then you have the other dynamic of it, more of regional protests, those groups that in the past benefited from Nashi and all these Kremlin vehicles. And now they don't see those social lifts and their conditions are actually worsening. This is driving the other protests potentially. So is that a problem or is it a benefit for the Russian opposition movements? Can you see those two different developments within these younger groups finding certain kind of compromise, or are they going to be fundamentally clashing with each other? And maybe that will provide the Kremlin with a chance to, to isolate them, disunite them, because they are very different in origin.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and to be honest, I will take Ambassador Herbst's cue on that and say we don't know yet. But I will still make a few comments on that. One point is that I don't think there is a way to currently unite those opposite movements within a single protest movement. So those young people who represent the so-called creative class, members of the first group, as you described it.
The Muscovites?
Yeah.
Big city residents?
They are fundamentally more liberal, even though there is a debate that these people are just fighting for power, and once they get into the office, into the public office, they will become the new sort of Putin or pro-Putin or proto-Putin group. Will use the same type of policies, etc. I don't think it's true, but the argument is still there. However, this group is still described as much more liberal, and people who speak on behalf of this group, they do understand what democracy is, what political participation is, so there is hope for them. On the other hand, the other group that has been forming on the remnants of the Nashi movement, it's still very active. There are projects that are funded by the government that are led by former Nashi commissioners, for example, that fight consumer problems. One of them was really popular, that has to do with a group of sort of civic-minded activists raiding local grocery stores and looking at the expired products, and it's all live on camera and people can watch it on YouTube. Basically fighting on behalf of the active part of the society for the greater good, but with like really dubious methods. These are the people that I think are more authoritarian minded and are more prone to become a new generation of the Putin regime, a new base of the Putin regime, unless there is a way to, I don't think you can really change them, but you can educate them and you can explain how political participation or pluralism or using different tools, political tools included, can actually benefit them. So they understand how their well-being will be better if they open up the economy and, you know, build a more inclusive society. But not at this point, because I don't think anyone is working with them. So we will have these two types of activism within the opposition or youth movement. But it's really hard to imagine how we can square them or marry them, or you know, unless there is an actual external threat, such as a war, where they come together.
In which case they will probably unite around Putin, right? Rather than
we don't know.
So essentially, to sum it up, we do in fact observe two different streams within this rising protest movements. One, even among the younger Russians, one is more creative and liberal, the other one more traditionalist core. Here it comes down to specific political technologies in which group the protesters, the opposition, or the Kremlin are going to be more successful in essentially taking them under control.
Right.
Ambassador, having heard all of that, essentially diverse streams within the Russian political landscape, what do you think the policy suggestions may be for the US community? Are there any ways to engage with certain groups in Russian society, such as, for example, the younger groups, for the US to foster certain, you know, to contribute to the development of the Russian civil society? Mark Carpenter, he has a recent article in Foreign Policy suggesting that the US should create more maybe exchange programs, you know, to engage the youth. To what extent it's a great idea, or maybe that will just give the Kremlin more reasons, you know, to come up with these external threats ideas?
We should certainly be engaging with Russian society, and Russian society across the board. So part of that are youth exchanges. We've done youth exchanges with countries around the world, and by and large they've been a big success. And that's true with the great exchange programs we had in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union. So that's point one. But point two, we shouldn't limit ourselves to youth. And we shouldn't limit ourselves to what, you know, as you refer to in your paper, as the non-systemic opposition, although we should pay a great deal of attention to them. We should reach out, if possible, also to more mainstream groups in Russia today. I think that there's an understanding in those mainstream groups that Russia is currently in a period of stagnation, that the current policies, now I'm referring to domestic policies, although I think these domestic policies fit with this policy of international provocation and revisionism, but the domestic policies are creating stagnation, and that if Russian patriots and simply Russian citizens who want to live better are going to live better, are going to be a part of a great country going forward, there have to be significant changes. And I think a dialogue about alternative futures for Russia would be very, very useful. And frankly, I don't have any doubt that Russian elites, especially the quote-unquote technocrats, and a good portion of the business community in Russia understand that. While I believe that Russia's future and the Russian political system in the future will look significantly different than it does today, I don't anticipate that that future system is going to be ultimately created by Russian liberals. That has not been the pattern in Russian history. But that's not a reason to assume that they'll be driven by troglodytes who create something more repressive than you have today. The liberals will open up the conversation and have an influence on the conversation and the eventual result. But there'll be some kind of mainstream in Russia which will say, again, we want a better life. We want to be a great power in 50 years. And we understand that crony capitalism, as practiced by Mr. Putin is not going to get us there. And that's how I suspect this will play out. But what I've just painted is a very broad brush painting. The details will come from specific things in which this protest movement may be a part.
So, in other ways, the United States should engage with the Russian society, but not just with the liberal groups, but
Yes.
in general, the more mainstream groups that are more likely to contribute to future Russia.
And that approach will undercut the notion, which is pushed by this massive Kremlin propaganda apparatus, that the West and the United States in particular are trying to destroy Russia.
Yeah.
No. We have an interest in a great Russia following the rules and unleashing its people and their enormous creative talents
Yeah, and
and their extraordinary natural resources, which are currently not being exploited properly because you have micromanagement from the crony capitalists around Putin and Putin himself.
Yeah, so it's important to understand that a successful, developed Russia is our mutual interest.
Correct.
It is the interest of the United States as it is the interest of the Russian civil society.
When Yakutia and Dalny Vostok can develop without commands coming from the Kremlin, Russia's on the right path.
Excellent. With that, I think that's all the time we had for the panel discussion, and I'm going to open up our discussion to the audience. Please raise your hands. Don't forget to introduce yourself, and we are happy to answer your questions. Yes, please.
Hello, Kathy Kosman. I have two specific questions. One is the 20% of the Russian population who are non-ethnic Russians, and there has also been a downgrading of the status of non-Russian languages in Russia very recently under Putin. So obviously this has led to some protests, and there's been no discussion of that yet. The other being that I believe it's correct that the permafrost is undergoing the most rapid negative effects of climate change, and obviously the peoples of the north, as well as the vast natural resources in that part of Russia, are also affected, and I'm sure the local populations there understand that also. So I'm wondering if you could discuss these issues a little more specifically. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, everything you mentioned definitely takes place. And yes, it's a huge protest movement in Ingushetia now, and in some other national republics. It's always unrest in Dagestan, for example. Yes, it takes place, and language issue is very important. In occupied Crimea, for example, Crimean Tatars, they always feel repression, and it's always an example of national group who disagree with Putin's policy. Yes, but unfortunately it doesn't affect Russian government seriously, because unlike, I don't believe actually that Russia could split now for many different countries, yes, because unlike the Soviet Union was created of national republics, but in current Russia it's a few regions created by a national criteria. So, and to fight for the rights, it should be independent national elites, and it's not possible under Putin's ruling, under authoritarian state. Even in national republics that people disagree with federal policy, governors, elites, they are appointed by Putin. So it's very hard to form independent elites. In Soviet Union, former Soviet republics, they had independence elites, and they could start this process of dismissing of the Soviet Union. But now I don't see these elites. For example, of course, it's a lot of contradictions between federal center and region, especially national regions. So about climate change, It, you know, it's this problem more relevant for the United States, for countries with higher living standards. But Russian people, people especially in small towns, as Olga mentioned earlier, they involved in the daily problems, the chores, and it's so hard for Russian people just to live day by day that they sometimes don't pay attention to some global tendencies and global problems. Probably they feel this effect, but they don't tie it with climate change or some global trends. They just face with some more social problems. They are angry to local authorities that they cannot solve these problems, but they don't think, majority of people don't think about these issues globally.
I just want to make a quick comment. So in terms of the nationalities, I think the only drastic issue that is being discussed on national, not even discussed, but mentioned sometimes on national level is the situation with the Crimean Tatars. Anything else is not part of the national agenda. And as for permafrost, Ksenia is right. It's climate change is not part of the national agenda in Russia, and climate change is not that grave an issue. Actually, Russia has benefited from it in a way because of the melting of the Arctic ice. Russia has more access to transport routes from China and can actually charge China for using that Russian waters in that sense. So, and beyond that, in terms of Paris Agreement, Russia is complying with all the criteria because Russia is not that much industrialized and can actually sell its quota of CO2 emissions. I mean, this is not something that the Russian government will be discussing in the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Gentleman in front, please.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat, and I specialize in future projection and modeling. Russia benefits fantastically from global warming, so I can see why they're not concerned. The one thing that I'm puzzled by when I look to the future is that Russia's national security concerns are high Muslim birth rates within the country and on the periphery, which always guarantees a few tens of thousands more jihadists, and China, of course, which is outpacing Russia at such a fantastic rate. Those are Russia's national security concerns. So how come Russia United can keep selling this business of NATO's going to attack us? An incredible fantasy, but here we are, 30 years later, and I'm still hearing this. When does Russia sort of wake up to this, that they're being pitched here? And also, I expected rioting in the streets when Russian Air Force was preferentially bombing hospitals and Syrian children. And there's nothing. Help me understand these two things.
You mean how Russian people still believe in this threat from NATO? First of all, Putin did a lot to make this true. I mean, we really have sanctions from the United States and from Europe. It doesn't mean that sanctions was wrong, it was a right move, but it was a response on Russian aggression. So, but Putin really created a confrontation between Russia and the West, and confrontation now is really exist, especially after Putin's interference in the United States election. So it's a real confrontation. The main point that Putin explains these confrontations by their own way. So saying that West will attack Russia no matter what, independently of Russia's policy. So it's just simply not true. It's direct consequences, direct result of his policy. But Russia has a real hot war with Ukraine. had real confrontation with the West. You can read American press about Russian interference in the United States policy. Again, it's true, it was proven by even Mueller's report, real fact of interference, but Russian propaganda says that everything is slander. You know what happened with Skripal poisoning attempt to kill of former general officer in Salisbury in Great Britain. So also Putin represents this situation as attempt of attack, some false accusation. And yes, for him all of this is evidence, and it's impossible to do anything, because it doesn't mean that the world shouldn't react on Russian actions. Of course it should react, but we should understand that yes, Putin will use all this reaction as an evidence of aggressive Western policy. And even the war with Ukraine, Putin managed to explain that it's America influenced on Ukraine and made Ukraine go against Russia. It's also, even Russian and Ukrainian war, Putin represents as a result of aggressive Western policy. So that's why I say that I suggest at least that Russian dissidents shouldn't ignore Putin's foreign policy and try to involve it in their agenda. For example, sometimes I heard from Russian opposition leaders that it's unpopular topic, so we shouldn't include it. But sometimes it's important to include, for example, with a horrible conditions of Russian medicine. Sometimes it's useful to mention that money that should be sent to medicine, to hospitals, they were sent actually to the war. And Putin started this war. Putin created this confrontation. Confrontation is really exist for now. But the main point that we should explain to Russian population that Putin put their life in danger by creating of this situation, but creation of this confrontation. But yes, it exists. It's true.
Also want to make a few points. So you're asking to explain why Russian people can't see the contradictions, right, in the propaganda, why they still fall for this NATO sort of conspiracy. Well, if you imagine, I mean, that's the question I ask myself every day, but if you try to imagine an average Russian person or an average American person, how much time do you actually spend daily critically thinking about foreign policy or any political issue? As for NATO, that has been part of the Russian foreign policy narrative for over 20 years. It's being repeatedly used generation after generation. It's become sort of so unconscious that whenever you say NATO, people will react. This is how propaganda works, especially if you're so massively bombarding it. The reason it's being used for so long is because it's been effective. If people didn't react to, NATO potentially destroying Russia, the Kremlin propaganda wouldn't use it. I mean, it's self-perpetuating cycle, basically. When we talk about jihadi threat or China threat that you said, these are local sort of threats that people living in Muslim regions or where Muslim population is a majority, they will understand that this is real, but this issue will never be on the national agenda, because that's the real issue, and no one wants to discuss what's going on really, because that will create a different image of Russia that Putin doesn't want. So, for example, if you live on the Far East, yes, you know that there is a lot of, thousands and thousands of Chinese actually living in this territory, buying land, buying property, opening up businesses. There is, if, for example, especially if you're nationalistic against China or Chinese people, you will feel like you live on an occupied territory. However, you also know that Moscow is very far away, and Moscow doesn't want to discuss it on a national level. So yeah, this is a big issue locally, and people try to do something with it locally, appeal to their local government. It's not going to be part of the national agenda. As for Syria, I think it's the same problem that we have with the propaganda in general. The way Syrian operation was portrayed to the Russian people is we are actually helping a legitimate government against some jihadi threat, and this is what people, they see it on TV, so it must be true. And especially if it's repeated over and over again and you don't get an alternative picture, or you don't have time to even think about it, you take the first message for granted. You take it and it's in your mind. It's really hard to push it out after that.
And quick point of optimism, actually, we see on the surveys that as the economic conditions are worsening, the support for anti-Western rhetoric and mobilization is declining in the surveys. So because salience of the domestic economic issues increases, so the propaganda narratives are probably going to become less powerful. More questions, please? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for this very interesting conversation. I'm Abby Miguel at the Solidarity Center. And, Olga, I very much take your point that this new generation didn't live through the 90s. But to me, it seems as though the 90s still influences a lot of what the kind of liberal opposition is able to do in Russia. And in all of these protests, you don't see a lot of call for fundamental human rights. They're not often phrased that way. And at the same time, Russia, as in many other places, seems to be moving significantly to the right. And the smart voting practice, showed us, I think, that if you want to diminish the power of Единая Россия, that means electing people who are pretty fascist. And so I'm wondering what the panel thinks about the future of these protest movements in terms of establishing something more along the lines of a liberalized democracy versus going further to the right in a post-Putin kind of world.
Everyone wants to know the future of this protest movement. I mean, me too. First of all, I think you're right. There is a certain shift towards populism. I mean, not a noticeable shift, both on the left and on the right. Sometimes I think out of desperation, even within the liberal opposition, there is a discussion, so maybe we should create a coalition with anyone who is against Putin and see what happens. And I understand this could be a test and try experiment, maybe it works. In 2011, 2012 protest, there was actually a big coalition. If you look at the pictures, you see nationalist flags, left front flags, Yabloko and all, everyone coming together against Putin, essentially. Well, that didn't work out. I think there is a great demand for the sort of left agenda, and that has not been met. And I think Sergei Udaltsov's efforts in this department were very effective. That's why he was jailed, essentially. And when we talk about future conversations about what can be done and what could be effective, well, I think at this point, any type of dialogue, any type of sort of constructive action could be something that the opposition movement can try and see if it works.
I think there was another hand out there.
Hello, Mary Lesline. So we sort of talked about the protest movement and their participation in democracy, but we didn't really touch on some other things that I read about what the protest was. The Duma protests were essentially about I've read elsewhere that they were not specifically anti-Putin. They were more like wanting inclusion in elections. What are your thoughts on that?
No, it's like Maria's questions about how it's possible to politicize protests. Yes, definitely many of these protest actions start like a local protest, not against Putin. And as I mentioned earlier, people even apply to Putin and ask him to help to solve the problem, and sometimes consider him as the only hope and the only opportunity to solve something. But many things depend on government response of this protest action. In many, even local protest actions, they quickly developed into anti-government protests and anti-Putin protests. When people realized that Putin was not going to help them and federal government didn't want to hear them. Yes, in Yekaterinburg it was a different situation when Putin paid attention and even tried to, I wouldn't say support opposition, but he didn't take church side completely. But in Moscow, we can see, because of brutal police response, it's evaluated into anti-Kremlin protest because it was government. It was obviously that it was government policy to beat people, to arrest people. Thousands of people were arrested under Moscow protest, and of course people understand that it's a result of Putin's repressive regime, that result of his policy. And so yes, many protests, they are not against Putin, but they can be developed into political side, and I hope that this trend of politicization protest actions will increase with time.
Just a couple more comments. I think when protesters have been going out, taken to the street for years, and still not achieving Putin leaving, you kind of sort of adjust your claims. So if Putin go away was a high bar, and it's really, well, what can you do to achieve it? So you have to focus on something concrete. So in Moscow, we saw first let those independent candidates be registered. That was the concrete demand of the protesters. And then, because the Moscow authorities did not respond to that claim, did not enter a dialogue, the protest escalated to the next level, where people protested against the actions of Moscow authorities. And then even with that, it was not enough, because police actions kind of fueled further resentment, further anger, and arrests of thousands of people, especially with police brutality that was, so obvious, that triggered further escalation. However, people know that once you sort of step up the protest and say, oh, it's against Putin, retaliation will be, proportionate to your claim. If you focus on concrete issue, maybe you can achieve something. When you shoot for Putin, it's a different issue.
Olga is absolutely right. I just wanted to add a couple of thoughts. That yes, this Moscow City Council, Moscow Duma elections, for many people it was a kind of, this Russian expression, internal immigration. So people already came in terms with the fact that they cannot influence on any global policies, they cannot achieve some higher goals like Putin's leave and Putin's removing from his office. So at least they believed that they could influence on something on the local level. And when they were deprived of this opportunity, of course it's created a new escalation.
So just on that term, on that note, I just want to say that Russian satirist Viktor Shenderovich traced the dynamic of the Russian jokes about Putin. And yeah, everybody has his or her own method, to study this topic. And he pointed out that in 2000s he observed Putin as being this benevolent guy. I mean, somewhat funny, but in the jokes, right? But increasingly, you see the jokes kind of turning against him. And right now, the jokes are extremely radical. Like he's a corrupt, he's a bad guy who is persecuting us. I mean, of course, it's just it's a very casual observation, but it tells you something about the change of people's attitudes. So we have time perhaps for one more question, if there is anyone who would like to answer a quick question. Yes, please, sir.
John Fantini, who do you, how long and in what capacity, for how long and in what capacity do you think we'll be dealing with Vladimir Putin? How long do you think he'll be around?
Everybody wants to know about the
Everybody
future.
wants to know.
In what capacity is the gist?
Well, I think he will stay in power beyond 2024. At least this is how things look right now. There is a discussion that there will be a unification or some sort of merger with Belarus that will create a super state, and Putin will become sort of chairman. There are other scenarios there, but essentially, what's the alternative? Do you see, under the current conditions, under the current tensions, Vladimir Putin risking retirement? It's really, I don't know. I don't think it's happening.
The only probably chance that if he wants to find some kind of successor for himself, they will create a special post for him, like for Nazarbayev, some honorable leader, so probably with not so much powers now, but also some high post for him.
So in the remaining minute, I'll just ask our participants to wrap it up. Perhaps you'll have some final thoughts that we haven't been able to touch upon today.
Yeah, I just want to, since we touched on the jokes, just remember the joke from Viktor Chernomyrdin. In terms of, he spoke about the sort of creative abilities of the Russian state. So whenever they try to build a party, they end up with the Communist Party, and I think that describes sort of the sentiment inside the Kremlin, and that showcases with the failures of the youth policy, where they tried to build a modern youth movement and ended up with another Komsomol.
Well, excellent. On that pessimistic note, I'm afraid we have to end. I really wanted to thank our esteemed participants, Ambassador Herbst, and Atlantic Council for hosting this event. Please keep following Russia's developments. I'm sure the change is coming in the future.